Welcome to Critical Conversations 2, where we have a town hall discussion on our topic today, or our question for you and for our panelists is, why are DEI implementations acceptable in corporate America, but not deemed necessary within institutions in the US as a whole? Now that's a loaded question, and there are a lot of aspects to how we in America do diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's another word that goes along with that, and that's belonging. But we're going to focus on the answer to this question in its entirety or break it into pieces. So as we start this critical conversation, I want to take a few seconds to introduce our panelists. I am so pleased to have each of them with us today, and we're going to look and see what their thoughts are to contribute to this conversation. So the first person I want to introduce is Sacha Thompson. She's an impassioned, and I say passionate, DEI practitioner and thought leader focused on bridging the gaps between diversity, equity, inclusion, and marketing community engagement. She has been instrumental in launching diversity efforts, managed global outreach programs and marketing campaigns, and has been recognized as a trailblazer in promoting DEI efforts in higher education and technology industries. Welcome, Sacha.
Thank you, Wanda.
Excited to have you here today.
Looking forward to this conversation.
All right. Next, I'd like to introduce, his name says Anthony Farmer on the screen, but I want to introduce Tony. He's the Chief of Inclusion at the National Reconnaissance Office. He's a seasoned leader with over 20 years of experience in the private and public sectors. He's an influencer who develops and implements comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategies. Tony is a proven leader who builds and leverages a diverse, collaborative network to create innovative solutions to complex issues. That sounds awesome, Tony. Welcome.
Thank you, Wanda. Pleasure to be here.
All right. Next up, Chris Armstrong. He's a highly sought after consultant, facilitator, speaker, and coach in the areas of organizational culture and diversity and inclusion. Chris has been called to assess and repair culture and diversity and inclusion challenges around several high visibility national level situations, to include the Charlottesville race riots, the aftermath of the killings of George Floyd, and the Kavanaugh confirmation. All told, he has facilitated more than 5,000 culture sessions across more than 170 government, nonprofit, and private sector organizations. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to it.
And last but not least, Atiba Madyun. He is the president and CEO of the Madyun Group, a government relations firm based in Washington, D.C., as well as Party Politics, a data collection firm that not only gathers data from American voters, but also engages with young people to educate them on public policy. His career has been planted firmly in the work and the world of multicultural affairs. In 2014, he traveled with a delegation of Muslim business leaders led by former South African ambassador to the US, Ibrahim Rusal, to South Africa to meet with South African business leaders and to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the first free elections that led to the election of President Nelson Mandela. Welcome, Atiba.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and Atiba's a brand new author as well, so you got to look him up on that.
Thank you. Shameless plug.
Yeah, that's all right. Got to do it. Got to do it. So I'm excited about this panel. I want to invite our Zoom audience to post your questions as we go along. We will have a question and answer time at the end of the conversation, but if there is a point that's made by any of the panelists, please feel free to post your questions and we can see if we can get them in during the first part of our conversation. Remember, we want to hear from you. We want to know what you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion implementations in the US as a whole. All right, so are you all ready to get started?
Let's
Awesome.
go.
Yeah. So Sacha, I want to kick it off with you this afternoon. I want to know, what are you seeing in diversity, equity, and inclusion implementations today? Are you seeing any sore points, anything that we really need to change?
Right now, honestly, what we're seeing is a scramble. There are a lot of people, a lot of companies that have had diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, but it was a light version. It was focused on gender. They were not prepared to deal with COVID. They were not prepared to deal with the racial unrest that's happening right now. And so what you are finding is a scramble for experts. You are finding people are scrambling for workshops. And it's not even just unconscious bias. Like, they don't even know what they want right now. And I think a big part of that is because, you hired folks that weren't necessarily experts to do the work to begin with. And so it's a lot of superficial performative activities that you're starting to see. A lot of these companies came out with these Black Lives Matter statements. And then all of a sudden, when their employees started talking about, oh, okay, Black Lives Matter. Right, let's talk about my experience here at this company. These companies don't know what to do. And so I think this is gonna go on for some time. What has been allowed to be performative up until this point is no longer acceptable. And so a lot of these companies now need to step up and do the work. They really need to, if they're gonna make the statements, they need to now put in the programs, the expertise to dismantle some of the oppressive systems that have been in place, and uplifting white supremacy, basically, which has been upholding a lot of this corporate space. So that's what I'm seeing right now.
Do any of the other panelists have any thought or perspective on that question about what you're seeing?
I would just say I see the exact same thing. And just two other things to sort of add, but they're both extensions. One is they want the training because the training is easier, get in and get out. But allowing people to bring their authentic selves into the workplace they're not totally comfortable with. And until that happens, then the training's not going to be worth a lick, because if people can't bring their authentic selves into the workplace, then you're not going to get an actual diverse experience, which brings me to my second point, which is I'm still seeing a lot of clients, wannabe clients, shall I say, who, despite all of what's going on, who want business cases. And we have to get out of that business, because the business case for diversity makes people seem like they're statistics and Gantt charts. And oh, by the way, we didn't need a business case to hire people who look like me. But that's what they still want, because that's where their comfort rests.
Okay.
So
I think-
Wanda, the only thing that I would add to that, I think Sacha covered a lot of it. There is a lot of confusion, misunderstanding, misguidance, mischaracterization as to what's needed during this time. So there's been a gut punch to all Americans. There's been a deeper hurt on the part of the African-American community. There is an anger that is born of, oh my goodness, not again, right? What do we have to do? Why haven't we progressed farther than we have? And then there's this magnetized notion that is overcoming our white counterparts, right? So now I see opportunity. Now we have an opportunity to have a conversation, but there's such shock and awe on both sides. There's such a traumatized impact on both sides that it's harder to bridge the gap than it ever was before. So as much as people want to do something, as much as people are trying to understand the impacts, they are poorly suited to have the conversation that actually bridges the gaps.
Also, I'll add this. COVID exposed the country to a virus that has already been ongoing for 400 plus years, and that's racism. So we've got to start, and we've got to go back to the past. Too often we're trying to have these conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion without including or talking about slavery, without talking about what capitalism is all built on. So we really got to go back to that. And these companies are having a hard time because those companies are built around the idea of capitalism. And it's built around the idea of getting as much as they can out of a worker without actually paying them for it, making them feel their worth. Just in terms of the virtual spaces, a lot of us have more time actually to focus on our families, yet we're still working long hours. It's really amazing, I think, that a lot of these companies are saying that there's still a high level of productivity that's going on. At the same time, people can go for walks, they can actually have time to go work out. There's a lot more to this. The other side, though, that I think that we really want to look at is where these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion are going to go. Because there's the harder part of this equation for white Americans is losing the privilege and entitlement that they have become so accustomed to having. And for Blacks and Hispanics and others, it's recognizing that, wow, this is this new thing, but you want to take advantage of it. I keep using this as an example in all my meetings is the play that was shown now on Disney Plus, Hamilton, of I'm not going to miss my shot. And right now there is a window that's open that we don't know how long it's going to be open. Personally, I would like to try to do as much as we can to keep it open as long as possible. But in terms of how we have these conversations, we have to also figure out what does equity look like to us? And what is, and then not only strategically move to make sure that it happens, but make sure that it stays. Because too often in the history of this country, we've seen different movements happen, that we've seen equitable change happen, but then something happened, 1980s crack epidemic, 1980s, Reagan administration, et cetera, that stopped the whole deal of progress. So we have to know the history, we have to talk about the history, and we have to then make sure that people don't forget the history and that we know the history so that they don't forget it, because that's the part where I think we keep missing the boat.
Now I want to jump in off of that, Atiba. Your space is the political space. And so we heard these comments about what's going on in organizations and in corporate America. How does diversity, equity, and inclusion fit into the political space?
Well, it fits in really well in that, you look at Congress, look at where Congress was 50 years ago and look at where it is today. People have been talking about Congressman John Lewis, but Congressman John Lewis's efforts in Selma led to more inclusion in Congress. When I say more inclusion, there's like 50 some Congressional Black Caucus members, there are 40 some Hispanic caucus members, among others. But you can't just look at this on a federal space. You've got to look at a southern space. So like with state legislatures, 50% of all the African American state legislators in this country are in the South. If you look at states like Mississippi, just about every Democrat in the state legislature in Mississippi is African American. And so we were just talking about that flag that was just changed. But the racism was still going on right there, even in the press conference that involved the governor announcing that flag, the change in the flag, because African Americans state legislators weren't invited there. The Republicans are in the power structure there. They did not invite the African American elected officials in that state. And we didn't hear a huge outcry about it nationally. And I know about it because I know state legislators there, and I saw their social media feeds and saw their pictures, talking about this. But, the conversation is like we get distracted too often from, and let me just backtrack a little bit because you asked me about the political space. Well, what happens in the political space? When we tend to be making progress, someone then uses the N word or does something that we deem as racist, and we get diverted from the goal in terms of what it is that we're trying to achieve. So within the political space, we've got to figure out not only how are we putting and finding more diversity, because even within our own race, we have issues. I mean, look at Cori Bush. Why that's such big news. Yesterday, she won, or this week, she won her election against a 20-year incumbent in terms of Congressman Clay. And she won because she's been out there on the front line doing the work, trying to make sure that there is more equitable solutions that are in place through Black Lives Matter. But these things or whatever that we're doing within the public space or within the political space, we've got to look at it in a way that's not just about getting people elected that look like us, but also in terms of how we're going to find allies who agree with us in order to push and to promote and to get public policy in place, so that DEI is not just acceptable as you have in corporate America, but it's acceptable and it is adhered to across educational institutions, across the board in hospitals, and et cetera, et cetera. Because when you start talking about racism and in terms of what's missing, I mean, these are life-changing situations that affect each and every one of us in some way or another. And sometimes we don't recognize that.
You brought up some great points. Not getting distracted and finding allies in this space, not just those who look like us. Is that something that you're seeing in corporate America and in other organizations, the need for that when we talk about DEI? And this is to the panel as a whole.
I think so. I mean, I think I'm starting to see people that have been quote unquote woke for a while, getting angry and wanting to now go beyond that anger into action. So I am starting to see a little bit more of that. I am starting to see some people now just starting to wake up to, oh, I didn't realize, it was this bad. And I don't like the fact that it took George Floyd's death to open people's eyes to that, but that's what unfortunately it took for some people to realize that. And so what I am seeing are a number of people stepping up to be allies. Now, there's a difference between being an ally in word and being an ally in action, right? And so I think that's an educational piece that needs to come into play as well too, because there are a lot of so-called allies that don't act as allies. And so how do you then educate people in that way to actually be an ally? And kind of going back to what Atiba's talking about, it's not just in what happens in a corporate space. It's what happens in your personal life. It's what happens in who are you voting for, right? Because it's all impacting all of it. And so what you're seeing in Portland and what you're seeing in all of these other protests is a part of that. People are starting to see that DEI is a larger effort than just what's happening when they go to work. What happens when they go to work? It does impact their day-to-day, or impacts marginalized communities in ways that we hadn't seen. And so a big part of that, I think, is COVID, because now a lot of that discrepancy came up, particularly with education. Those gaps really were highlighted in who has access and who doesn't. And so this is just the perfect storm right now. And so I think a lot of those allies that were living in their glass bubble of sorts are now starting to see, okay, this isn't what I thought it was.
All right, I want to tie together two things that were said really quickly. The idea that George Floyd woke people up. But I think one of the things that Atiba said, adding on to that, was, I think it was a combination of the fact that people were also in a COVID work from home state where they weren't distracted enough to say, oh, that just happened on the news, and they were able to focus in. So it was that perfect storm of both of those things.
Exactly. I mean, I think if people were at work, they wouldn't have seen it, right? Or it would have been fewer people to have seen or experienced that 9 minutes and really take that in. But now you're seeing that with your children. right, with your parents. And so now it forces a conversation that I don't think we've ever truly had as a country.
I think it also, there's so many metaphors with the 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It was actually, as you said, Sacha, it was more than 8 minutes and 46 seconds. But we were shocked. That's what we weren't distracted, and then we were shocked because we've heard about these instances forever. We've seen them. We saw, Eric Garner. We saw Tamir Rice. We saw Mike Brown. We saw Sandra Bland. We saw, so many of these instances happen, and we were just, like James Baldwin says, in a rage. We were enraged. We yelled out. We marched. We protested. But for the first time, and I think God's infinite wisdom was this virus that stopped the whole world, forced us to then look within and to see the white plantation owner metaphor at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, who continues to propagate an idea indoctrinated in people for centuries that white is great and that America is all white, as opposed to now you're seeing people start, as you said, Sacha, become woke. But this is the concern that I have. I see a lot of people who don't look like me, who don't have my skin color, who are claiming to now be allies, but they can be allies when it's convenient. And what I think we have to do is push until they are uncomfortable, and uncomfortable to an extent of, this is how we feel in our sleep. This is how we feel when we are reminded when we wake up. This is how I feel when my child goes to school. It's the continuation of, like, you've been telling us to get over this for a long time. This is why we can't get over it, because our health outcomes. I just saw something where the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, talked about being slightly depressed. We're talking about the First Lady of the United States of America. Imagine all the racism that she, her husband, her children experienced over the 8 years of being while her husband was president of the United States. And a lot of the stuff that we're seeing is a byproduct of people being so appalled that a Black family could live in the, I hate to say it, I don't even say the word, in the president's residence at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I'm saying it from this standpoint because words matter, and we've got to change and use new language in order to forge a new way, because people keep talking about, keep asking me, when do you think we're going to go back to a sense of normal of what happened before this? There is no sense of normal before this. There is a new reality that is being born out of this.
Thank you. We talked about allies and allies when they're comfortable. Chris, I want to throw the question to you because it's part of your job to push people to understand and facilitate and have these conversations which are uncomfortable. What are you seeing in your exposure? What have you seen when you went to help mediate these or facilitate these conversations? What kind of pushback? How would you describe where we are?
I think where we are is we have a lot of people who fancy themselves social justice warriors, but in conversation and facilitation, they're really social justice warriors. And here's what they worry about. They worry about doing too much because they see someone else's gain as their loss. They worry about saying the wrong things, but they wouldn't say the wrong things if they did some research. They want to step forward as people who are truly sorry for what's happened, but they won't take any responsibility for it happening. and I don't say this to put them down, because it is difficult in one sense to be told, just sit down and shut up and let us talk, and at the same time try to talk. But the reason by and large people are told to sit down and shut up and listen isn't because they're talking, it's because they're not getting educated before they talk. Or as my colleagues have already said, they're only talking when a tragedy occurs. So I would say in the most cases that I facilitate, and it's always Vince Brantley and I say that because I know loud and clear that there has to be people in the conversation who look differently, and then there's different resonance, there's different relatability, there's different experiences we bring, and Tony's done some of this work with us. I guess I would just end by saying, when I see this, particularly in corporate America, the challenge that people have, particularly people who look like me, who want to be part of the solution, have is, in addition to not having done any research and really at the core being scared of loss, because that's what we get to, what's the root issue? They are really, at their core, angry that they're getting blamed for something they don't think they have any responsibility for, in a system that they believe was resolved on December 2nd, 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was signed, not realizing that that was really the Independence Day for an entire race of people, race being a construct, of course. And it's difficult at times to get them to understand that until you ask them a question like, do you believe on December 3rd, the day after, that Sacha and I would be seen equal in the eyes of an interview panel? Of course, the answer is no. So then I get the well-paying job, she doesn't. Whose children fare better? Well, mine do. And then you multiply, and we're only 3 generations removed from there. It is difficult to get them to see that because so many of them are head people, and all they see is the law says so, so it must be so. What would you add, Tony? Because I know you and I have done this before together.
I think there's a number of things that Atiba, Sacha, and yourself have brought to light in this conversation, and I'll key on this. A, to quote Sacha, there's been a scramble. B, because of the COVID isolation, quarantine, and the focus on George Floyd's death and how it happened, I think that has been illuminating and traumatic. And then, Chris, I would say, based on the work that you and I have done and continue to do in our various venues, I would say that the people who want to be allies have to be taught what being an ally is by people who have been exhausted in a system that is designed to work against them during a time where those same people are mourning and trying to invoke a voice of intelligence and purpose, determination, and reform, which makes the air chaotic, misty, confusing. So it's the work that we do and have to do yet is to clarify those lanes, clarify an understanding, clarify, and Atiba talked about it. So I think sometimes we get so hung up on where we want to go that we have to educate a little bit on where we came from. When Chris started his answer to the question, he talked about December 3rd, 1964. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean? And why is that important? Why is Juneteenth important? Why is the death of John Lewis important? Why are we impacted when somebody mistakes him for another civil rights leader? These are all the things that we have to put on a board and say, look, here are the micro aggressions, here are the micro insults that we have been experiencing for generations. Now that you see them, now you need to understand and listen to how this impacts us and how it forces us to show up differently in the areas that we have responsibilities for. Now, if you want to do something about it, it requires another level of courage and bravery that you've been previously required to exhibit. And so I think that's the work. I think that, for those of us who are in this space and want to create a positive impact for the generations moving forward, we have to be able to educate on what's happened in the past, create a lane where allies can come, sit down, pay attention, listen, be heard, and yet listen, give credence to what's being said, and come to the table ready to provide some solutions from a whole different mindset. So a paradigm shift here is what's in order, and that is one of the most difficult things for the human condition to contend with, a paradigm shift. And Atiba talked a lot about it. I think what I gleaned from his contribution to the conversation is there are those of us who have been experiencing this for over 400 years, and we're impacted in a certain way. There are generations of people on the other side of this who think, well, if this happened to an African-American person, then what did they do? So they have the luxury of sitting back and sitting in their headspace to try to add, provide some type of logic or come up with some type of logic as to what they're seeing. In this case, all logic has been thrown out. And so now we have to deal with the very painful reality that we have barely scratched the surface on these conversations that will move us forward as not only as a community, but as an entire race of people.
I also want to add in this. I think I'm reading a book called Chocolate City, and it's about Washington, D.C. And the part that I'm on right now goes a lot into the conversation about 3 different areas that are related to slavery. 1, there's those who wanted to maintain slavery. 2, there were the abolitionists who wanted to get rid of slavery. And 3, there was the colonization effort to move the formerly enslaved or those who were enslaved back to Africa. I mention that because forever in our existence in this country, there's always been someone else who's been trying to navigate our way. And right now, because of what happened with George Floyd, and because of the protests and what we've seen play out with Black Lives Matter, we are in a unique position, which is how do we define what DEI looks like? And so, like in the play Hamilton, I'm not gonna miss my shot. So, the thing is that now it's how do we take and make sure that we don't miss that shot, at the same time be inclusive of many numerous different viewpoints and around these various issues, and at the same time have a reckoning so that we can come to some sort of reconciliation within this country and an identity that makes it possible for a Black woman to be on the ballot to run for president without there being this whole discussion about why she shouldn't be there. So it's like, we got to figure out ways that we get out of our own way and navigate this wet thing and recognize that we are better because we have different viewpoints, but make sure that those viewpoints are one that knock us off course because it becomes a distraction.
Excellent. So as we go into the last 30 minutes of this panel, I've been listening to a lot of young people who've been talking about this whole situation. And what I've heard quite a few times is a statement that they make, and I'm not sure that they totally understand what they're saying, but just to throw the whole thing out and let's start over again with policies, procedures, how we do stuff. Now, I can see that maybe in something similar to that working in corporations, trying to redefine, but there's a whole culture issue. But when we talk about let's just do this all again, that I don't see how that would work in a political structure. What do you think about some of these radical ideas from young people? And can you just take a stab at one thing that in your lane that you want to put forward in this time, not miss your shot? What is one thing that you would like to bring into your space that can make a difference?
Wanda, if I was, I counsel and coach a lot of younger people. And the one thing that I stress is know the process, understand the structures, understand how the dependencies work. so that when you are challenging the status quo, you're doing it from not only a point of passion, but you're doing it from a point of knowledge.
And I guess what I would add, and it's similar, I think a lot of our policies need to go. I think a lot of the laws need to go. But you replace those with new laws and you still have the same people overseeing them. This is like when we do culture assessments and we say policies are never the root solution ever. They're also never the root issue, because people write policies, people interpret policies, and people decide whether they're going to execute policies. So we can rewrite all the policies we want. Who's going to be writing them? The same people who have us where we are today. What I like about the younger generations today is their courage. And I do believe that we need a reckoning, but it is with the political system, and it starts with multiple terms for congressmen and women and senators, and the ability for someone to run on a platform and never ever have to actually live by that platform as long as they can keep getting reelected. There's no fear in politicians because all they have to do is get reelected, and they can promise us things every 4 years. If we want to see a reckoning, then we need to see more people in Congress and the Senate who are like AOC, who are like Talib. Even if you don't agree with every one of their principles, it's the idea that they're tired of the establishment. Make no mistake about it, even the current occupant of the White House is in the White House because there were people who were tired of the establishment. The one thing I would say to answer your question about what would I do is I would get rid of unconscious bias training, because it is a crutch. I teach a class called, Tony and I both taught it, actually, called Unconscious Bias, B-Y-U-S, because it is our actions, it is our mindset, and it gets with this whole thing about change takes time. Change does not take time. That is a virus of the mind. We are the change. And it's not just a philosophical statement. It's just a reality that we act as though it takes centuries and years for humans to change, but we're the stinking humans. So that's what I would do. Get rid of unconscious bias training. I professionally will never teach it again. I don't care how much money someone throws at me. It is a crutch. Sorry for the bluntness.
No, that's what we're here for.
I'm over here cheering. So I'm like, yes, get rid of it.
Yes. I love it.
I agree. But no, I wanted to kind of follow up on that a little bit, because I think I'm young at heart. And so I've always been the hellraiser, and like, just burn it down. And that's just been my my philosophy since college, probably before then. But I think there's power in what Tony said too, right? You can't just burn it down without having a plan. And so anyone that has worked with me, or anyone that has been a part of anything that I work in, it's okay, you have plan A, B, and C. You have to understand the establishment and know what makes them tick. What is their ask? What is it that they want out of this? And how do you work backwards from that, right? But then you also have your plan B and plan C, and each level escalates. And so it takes a lot of that power, that passion and desire to burn it down into strategy. And so that, I think, is the piece that generation is missing a little bit of, is how to create a strategy behind everything that they do. And so I'm always going to be that one that's going to encourage them, like, yes, let's burn it down, but let's see, how are we going to do this, right? And how are we going to think through this in a way that does not put you in a position that you are now at risk, right? The flip side of that, though, is when there are allies involved, because you always have to do this with some allies. My question to them is, what are you willing to risk in this? What are you willing to let go? What are you willing to put on the line that you can never get back again? And that then does tell you, who your allies are and aren't. But it also does not put the onus on those that are most marginalized, because we always tend to be the first to get knocked out. And so there has to be a balance, but there also has to be a strategy.
So I'm going to start with mine policy in terms of reparations. I'm going to say that we also have to be realistic and not idealistic. And I'm going to share a little piece that I am a 7th cousin of Frederick Douglass. And being able to chart and know my history is very important. This is important for each of us in this country. So let's just say, for instance, hypothetically, they come up with a plan and they say there's going to be reparations. And let's just use Bob Johnson, the founder of BET's formula, $16 trillion, which means each one of us would get about 300 and some thousand dollars. I think there's a number of things that you have to be cautious of. One, how many of us would get that money because we can track our lineage back to slavery? Two, how many of us are financially responsible enough to get that money and that it would also pass on to our children? So that's financial literacy. Three, how many of us are in a position where we will recognize that it's important to educate and to invest that money in a way that it works for us, as opposed to, oh, excuse my language, oh shit, I'm gonna go and get me the Nikes, I'm gonna go buy me a car, I'm gonna go buy my mama a house, and before you know it, you ain't got no money. And you still have a mortgage because you didn't have enough money to buy that house that you thought you were gonna get for your mom. So I say this because I agree with everything that has been said here. I just want to piggyback on the thing that in terms of for strategy, it's also about education. It's also about, if there was reparations, how many of us can actually go back or even know how to chart that back to the fact that we were slaves. Thankfully, my mother and my father have family that not only own land, but we have family cemeteries. And so when I go back to those cemeteries, I'm always like getting those stories about who are on those headstones. I mean, I've gone all the way back to 1730. My great grandfather, James Reed, who we think was the first on that line from my grandfather, first African to come here to America. And we think that because different generations, including my grandfather, were named James. And somehow we think that might have got lost in some type of translation, because on my line, there is no James. And we think that it was a way of remembering the first one who came here. So I'm saying this, and the reason why I will keep going back to the history is that we keep hearing these terms of DEI, but if you're in corporate America, if you're in these institutions that are not implementing DEI, or if they're implementing it, but you don't really know what that's supposed to mean, a lot of it keeps going back to because we don't know who we are. And so we've got to spend as much time as getting back and helping each other find out who we are. There was a reason why in 1977, when Alex Haley's book Roots came out, why it was such a phenomenon. It was because we don't know who we are. And the fact that he was able to tell a story like that and to show the N-word being used, to show the whipping, to show the blatant racism was a shock to the system. And we have to keep getting back to that place. And we want to see equitable solutions and a diverse and inclusive society. We've got to know who we are in order to know how we fit into it all.
Piggyback on that, there's a pride in that too, right? It's like you have to build that pride back. And Black Americans, I use that term, a lot of that pride has been stripped. And so in listening to you and hearing that and knowing the family, there's a lot of pride that comes along with that. And so when you have that pride, then you can start talking about equity, right? Now you can start talking about inclusion. But until you have that solid foundation, a lot of this is just abstract to so many people. So I just wanted to tag that in.
And some of us may never be able to go back that far, but if we can figure out how to go back as far as we can, at some point, knowing that there's going to be other things that are going to come. I mean, we've got ancestry.com and, whatever that other one is, but I'm mentioning those not because, there's some people that are cautious of this and that, and I understand that. But, right now we're talking about a virus that's plaguing the world and really ravaging African-American communities. And, some people are like, I can't wait for there to be a vaccine. Well, if we're not part of the clinical trials for that vaccine or cure for it, when that medicine or that whatever comes out, then we're going to be critical of the fact that, well, this doesn't work the same way on us as it does for them. Well, it's because we didn't include ourselves also in that. And so I know there's a lot of mistrust, and there's, rightfully so, but I think we've also got to be figuring out ways, again, strategically, how are we getting our doctors, our clinicians, our researchers that are going to be in these positions, in these roles, so that we feel more trust. And that's where you have to be holding these companies accountable. And yes, it is a sense of pride in terms of knowing who you are, but it's also a recognition of knowing that you have a role and a responsibility, not just for yourself, but something that's greater than yourself. And that's where I think that sometimes this country has built so much, and we see that with this whole issue of wearing a mask, not wearing a mask. It is built solely on a structure of individualism. And yet our culture is one of family. And so we've been stripped of that when we were stripped of it through slavery. We've been stripped of it through economic means. We've been stripped of it in so many ways. We've got to figure out how we get back to that, and to make sure that this country recognizes that when our communities and families are strong, when our bank accounts are good, when we can go to work and feel comfortable in the institutions, we make this country a better place. And we have to tell the story that way. We can make this a better place, but you've got to let go of some of these other norms that you keep excluding us from to make it safer for all of us.
I love it. Now, Anthony, you responded to the question, but you didn't say your one thing. You've had time to think about it. What is your one thing that you want to leave in your space right now?
The most important thing to me, Wanda, one of the things that is the core of who I am is I'm a coach. I've been an athletic coach. I've been a life coach, an executive coach. And the most important thing to me in all cases, Chris knows this very well, is awareness. If I can raise awareness in front of me and around me, then I can raise a conversation to another level. One of the things that Atiba said that really resonates with me is just having that history and understanding where you're coming from. So my job as a coach often is to figure out where you are, right? And then try to create building blocks as to where you want to be. That would include defining success. That would include defining the ethos that you want to be around you. What kind of gravitas do you want? And all of that comes first through awareness of self, awareness of others, and then trying to create that awareness around me. If there was one thing that I really could impart to those who are in my environment, in my culture of work, would be awareness. And I'm working actively to do that.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Tony. I mean, this has been so lively because in your conversations, the question said necessary in the US as a whole. And just in conversation, I've heard everything from inclusion in vaccines to, our not just our inclusion in the political system, to our inclusion in these facilitation rooms and helping people really understand, take ally to action. This is the US as a whole. These are these places. And I forget who said it, but you hit the nail on the head for my belief. This is an internal work. It starts with the questions that we ask ourselves. Are we honest with ourselves about what we believe and what we don't believe? So as we're wrapping up to the last few minutes of this, I want to ask a question about belonging. We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. My favorite term with that is belonging, because you can have all that and a person not feel like they belong. I felt that in the technology space all the years that I was in it. I was a star, but I did not find a place of belonging. So can you please share with me what you feel about belonging and its part in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I'll just say, I think you've seen the picture I posted on LinkedIn, where I was basically had diversity at the very bottom of the ladder and belonging at the top. Diversity is about counting people. Inclusion is about making people count, but it's selective. I get to decide who I include. Equity is what matters when it comes to even allowing people to be included or even to get hired to up that diversity. But if they walk in the organization and they don't feel belonged, it doesn't matter. And the only way that you can make people feel belong is if you let them bring their authentic selves into the workplace. Get rid of dress codes. Get rid of communication standards that were created by white people that require code switching, which is still real. And I know that sounds harsh, and I say that as a white person, but nobody's going to feel like they belong unless they feel like they don't have to change who they are when they leave their car to walk into a building, or when they turn on their computer now in the remote work age and don't feel like they have to put on a different face. And the only way we do that is to redefine how we define success, what success looks like in dress, what it looks like in how people talk, and frankly, what it looks like in who's a good leader. Because we still promote people who are technically proficient but can't pick their folks out of a lineup because we don't value humanity when it comes to leadership.
I don't know. I found that the dressing part interesting, but I understand the sentiment. The question makes me think of Malcolm X saying that the most segregated day in America is on Sundays, and people go to a white church, go to a black church, go to Orthodox church, go, et cetera. My uncle was on my father's side, and I have an aunt who's 100 years old, who her grandparents were slaves. That's how close, here we are in 2020, and there's someone still living today whose grandparents were slaves. In terms of really addressing this stuff, and I think about my uncle Odell, who fought racism in the church, the whole thing is about how it's not just how we make this look, it's about how it feels and what feels right. And we live in a country, words matter. So in terms of what you were just saying, Chris, in terms of code switching, it makes me also think of the name, the United States. We're made to believe that the states are these 50 different individual states around the country, but I think that it's really the United States of being, the United States of mind, the United States of, all of us have a different state. In terms of the Black community, we have a different state of wellness, than other people do in this culture. And so I would just say, words really matter, and we just got to really figure this out from the standpoint of the language and the new normalcy and what that looks like. And so while I might disagree, Chris, in terms of, changing the whole way of dress, and I only say that just because I feel like as an ancestor of slaves, it was about trying to look good, trying to dress up, our condition. But I think that just overall how this whole thing is, we've got to keep thinking about what our state of mind is and what it is that we want to be our state of well-being to be and what that looks like.
Wanda, the only thing that I would add on to Chris and Atiba, introduced and contributed, I would say that there, again, the word that rings in my head is awareness. One of the things that I am completely aware of is what happens in a boardroom, a corporate boardroom, an executive boardroom, the C-suite. And I'm very cognizant of, one, people of color, whether, if they're in the room or not, and two, the voice that they are given. Now, the third thing I'm looking for is, once they're given a voice, how are they received? How are they listened to? How is what they are saying translated? And I'm always focused on the facial expressions, the body language. So my commentary, both at the table and in the closed door sessions, is think about how much talent exists in those margins, right? You didn't give somebody an opportunity to talk. Maybe you didn't give them an opportunity to contribute because of your assumptions and generalizations on how they come off, how they communicate, how they enunciate. And so I think when we talk about belonging, I think there has to be the creation of space, to Chris's point, to let people show up as their total selves, right? And I think the idea, particularly around the recommendation of dress, is to allow people to show up as their best selves. You know, I grew up in church, and to Atiba's point, church meant that you show up with your best, wearing your best, giving your best presentation of self. Well, if I'm going to work and I want to contribute, represent the same, my family, my culture, and all those things that make me who I am, then I might think, oh, I want to dress a certain way to present a certain way. Well, that might not mesh with the environment, or people may see me in a different way than I see myself. But if we have an environment where you come as you are, and you are valued for the knowledge, education, and skill set you bring to the table, then I think we have a better chance at including or connecting the belonging piece to diversity and inclusion.
I'm just going to plus one to what everybody else said. I think what stood out for me, particularly at and what Chris said around this ladder concept, we aren't at belonging yet. Like, we're still trying to figure out diversity and inclusion, and definitely haven't started figuring out equity, right? So we can't begin to tackle belonging until we get these other pieces and elements right. And so that's kind of been my mindset. Like, for the last few years, I've been focused on equity and what does that look like? And even with COVID, I've been saying this is the time to rebuild, because we're not going back to this. There's no sense of going back, right? So how do we use this time to rebuild and build equity centered in that? We're seeing all of this discrepancies, education, healthcare, whatever it is. How do you use this time to rebuild with equity centered? And so once we start having that process and that mindset, then we could possibly start talking about belonging, but we're nowhere near that at this point.
And I would just like to add, because I want to go back to the initial question about but not deemed necessary within institutions as a whole. And just to say, to those other institutions, even to corporate America, really just imagine how much talent you're leaving on the field. I mean, there's some huge wins that you could be getting, but you're leaving so much talent just out there, just withering away.
Yeah. I love that. I think this has been such a rich conversation. I think in so many points, anyone who's been watching could pull out other small conversations from the comments that have been made, the conversation that's been had. And time always goes by way too fast when we're having this panel. The first critical conversations on social and economic disparities and systematic racism went by, and I had 6 panelists. So this conversation, I was like, I'm going to get smarter, right? I'm only going to have 4, because I am surrounded by powerhouses of knowledge, of passion, who are not just in these fields because it's just a job. This is who you all are. So as we're closing out for this second session of critical conversations, looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion implementations, and how they affect the United States right now in this time, so that we can have these critical conversations, so we can stop being afraid to be wrong, or afraid to be connected to something that we don't have a responsibility for. I just want to say, take something that Anthony said, take something that Atiba said, take something that Sacha said, take something that Chris said, and start your own critical conversation. And so I want to thank everyone for being here. We didn't have any questions come in from our Zoom audience, but please tell others about these critical conversations. We will share this video and it will be available on YouTube to view, and leave your comments there. I know that each of these panelists loves to be engaged in conversation. They would love to hear from you, because this is part of our bag that we take everywhere with us, so that we know what our hands on the pulse of what's going on around us in our particular areas. And I just want to say thank you once again to the four of you for taking the time to be here and share your thoughts and your conversations. And I look forward to maybe having another critical conversation with you again in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wanda.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Wanda.
Okay.